will be taking a topic related with feminism, and my today's topic is the late 19th century campaigning women. So, uh, there are lots of stages and of feminism, and in that there are centuries also. So I am taking centuries since many days. So yesterday I have taken early 19th century, and today the late 19th century. So it was not until the second half of the 19th century that anything like a true women's movement began to emerge in England. This movement converged particularly around Barbara Leigh Smith and the group of friends who have become known after one of their early meeting places as the Ladies of Langham Place. The group initiated more organized campaign around issues that had already been clearly defined: women's urgent need for better education and for increased possibility for employment, as well as the improvement of the legal position of married women. So, the basic need which women in the late 19th centuries was fighting was education and employment in the European countries. And though now they have all the rights, but in 19th till 19th century also they were denied all these rights. So the women came together in part as a reaction against that seemed to be a narrowing defining of femininity and an increasingly conventional and constricting notion of a proper womanly sphere. A Victorian woman's highest virtue seems to have been nervously, if frequently, equated with genteel passivity. A middle class woman who had to earn her own living might be lucky enough to find a poorly paid position as a governess, even though she had probably been skimpily educated herself. Few other occupations were open to her, and there was still no way out for a woman who found herself unhappily married. So there were very less opportunities for women in terms of job, and most probably they were hired as governess, not as a teacher. And in those days they were self-schooled, or they were given education at home, not in school. So mostly all the ladies, they were taught at home. Sadly, even women with impressive achievement of their own women who have written with great sympathy and insight about women's life and struggle, seem sometimes to have shielded away from an early emerging feminism. Mary Ann Evans, George Eliot, despite her remarkable understanding in Middlemarch, which was published in 1871 to 1872, of the way a woman intelligent and talent may be denied an adequate outlet, and despite the fact that she became a close friend and supporter of Barbara Leigh Smith, remarked in 1853 that woman does not yet deserve a better lot than man gives her. So, this Mary Ann Evans, which is the real name of George Eliot, and George Eliot was her pen name. She has to hide her identity, disguise herself as a male, and to write behind a disguise. And so this was the place of women in the society at those time, that they were not allowed to write. And so to write they have to disguise themselves as male, or take up the male name for writing. So and she praised the way an exclusive type of gentleness, tenderness, possible maternity may suffice a woman being with affectionate. In 1856, the novelist Mrs. Gaskell, author of Ruth, published in 1853, and North and South, published in 1855, dismissed the very notion of women training as doctors. I quote, "I would not trust a mouse to a woman if a man's judgment was to be had. Women have no judgment. They have tact and sensitiveness, genius, and hundreds of fine and loving qualities, but are at least angelic geese as to matters requiring serious and long medical education." And in 1857, Elizabeth Barrett Browning argued in Aurora Leigh that, I quote, "A woman must prove what she can do before she does it. Prate of women's right, of women's mission, Women's function till the men who are prating to on their side cry. A woman's function plainly is to talk. Barbara Leigh Smith, after she got married, she broke with convention and simply added her husband name, body on to her own, was born into a family that was wealthy but untypical. Her parents were not married, so they were unconventional parent, and in those time it was something very rare, and it was not related with the society of that time. Her father has always encouraged her to read and made her a generous allowance, which meant she could afford to travel widely. She spent time in Europe with Bessie Rayner Parkes, who went on to write remarks on the education of girls and who also insisted that single women would prove crucial to any improvement in the lot of all women. So, in a review at the time, mocked both, they were mocked by in both Parker and Naismith, who had just published a pamphlet on women and work, sneering that women are fatally deficient in the power of close consecutive thought. In 1857, recuperating in Algeria after an illness, Leigh Smith met the man who became her husband, the physician Eugene Bodychon. They spent a year in America after their wedding, where in Boston, New York, and New Orleans she met women who were interested in education as well as others who had trained as doctors. Uh, at Seneca Fall, she had long conversation with Lucretia Mott, who was an activist both in the slavery movement and in the emerging campaign for women's right. Leigh Smith would go on to work on the areas which seems most urgent. The legal problem of married women, the urgent necessary for better education and training for women, as well as the need to extend the limited employment possibility available to them. In 1854, Barbara Leigh Smith had produced a pamphlet titled A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws of England Concerning Women. So these women, they had to fight against the unjust society and of Europe, whether it was England or any other country, because they were denied all the rights which they have gained just now. She began by considering the contradiction limiting single women. They were allowed to vote at parish, but not even if they were tax-paying property owner at parliamentary election. She moved on to even greater disability facing married women. A man and his wife are one person in law. The wife loses all her right as a single woman and her existence is entirely absorbed to that of her husband. So in those time in Europe, if a woman marries, then she her property or all her income was given to the man, and it automatically goes to man. So this was something very unjustified. She discussed the question of marriage settlement and the custody of children if parents separated, and even uncovered the curious and troubling legal fact that once a couple were formally engaged, a woman could not dispose of her property without her fiance's knowledge and agreement. So even the fiance got all the right his fiance. Her manifesto sold for a few pence. It was very widely read and went to 3 editions. In December of the following year, she and a group of like-minded women, including Bessie Parks and Anna Jameson, formed a Married Women Property Committee, which was England's first organized feminist group, which circulated petition for law reform throughout the country and had gathered some 2,400 signatures. The committee's intervention led to a series of amendments which elevated the financial situation of married women, even if the changes still did not radically define their right. Leigh Smith had also produced an article first published in the newly founded English Women's Journal in 1858, in which she argued strongly against the view that middle class women, because they were expected to marry, should be prepared for nothing else. Large numbers would probably never marry and might have to support themselves. But even those who did marry, she argued, should be equipped to educate their children and, if necessary, to take on work outside the home. Moreover, she insisted on the values of work for its own sake. To bring a family of 12 children into the world is not itself a noble vocation. To be a noble woman is better than being a mother to a noble man. She even invoked Queen Victoria, who was, after all, both a mother and a working monarch. At the same time, Leigh Smith insisted on greater recognition of the value of the very real work that women already did, looking after the home and raising their family. Leigh Smith actually set up a primary school in London, which survived for nearly 10 years. Boys and girls were taught together, and her own nieces and children of her friend learned alongside the children of workers who lived in the neighborhood. The English Women Journal, which was at first largely funded by Leigh Smith, seem to have reached and often inspired to action a reasonable wide audience. Even George Eliot, who has initially been very doubtful, wrote at the end of 1859, reassuring her friend that it must be doing good substantially, stimulating women to useful work and rousing people generally to some consideration of women's need. But Leigh Smith and Bessie Parks were soon confronted at first hand with the problem of women uh, employment. Readers at their journal, despite for work, began coming to their office, which has moved from Langham Place to Cavendish Squares. They decide to keep an employment register only to discover how few opportunities were in fact available for women. Many men bitterly resented the prospect of women entering their trade. Women, they argued, would lower wages for employment, and their presence might well force men into unemployment. Employment possibility concerned often women as well. Earlier that year, Harriet Martineau, who was familiar with the work of the Langham Place group and probably influenced by it, though she was never actually a member, had published in the Edinburgh Review an article called Female Industry, which took a cool, hard headed look at the few openings that were actually available to women. She saw clearly that the situation of women was changing. More and more women had no choice but to go out to work. The concept of earning one's bread, what she argued, a fairly recent one for men as well as women. I quote, "We live in a new commercial and industrial economy, but our ideas, our language, and our arrangement have not altered in any corresponding degree. We go on talking as if it were still true that every woman is out to be supported by father, brother, or husband. Poor women might labor in the field or in factories. Apart from that, Martineau could see only two equally low paid possibilities: needlework or teaching. Like Barbara Leigh Smith, she insisted that women education must be extended and improved, and that a fair field should be open to their power and energy. She praised Elizabeth Blackwell, who had trained as a doctor in America and who was visiting England at the time. Barbara Leigh Smith and Bessie Parks helped to organize the talk Blackwell gave, not just in London but in provincial centre as well. But unlike many of these early feminists, uh, and because she believed strongly that women should make no more than moderate and rational claims, she had little sympathy with the emerging demand for the vote. Frances Power Cobb, as noted in the previous chapter, as I have already discussed in my previous lecture, an advocate in the campaign for the Married Women Property Act and of Education for Women, did go on to campaign for women's suffrage, believing that women could not necessarily rely on men to protect them or their interest. Her argument to this end sometimes betray a hint of class arrogance. She was angry that we women of the upper rank, constitutionally qualified by the possession of property, and it may be permitted to add naturally qualified by education and intelligence, at least up to the level of illiterate orders of voter, are still denied the suffrage. She was always profoundly conservative, though her disapproval of the radical wing of the Conservative Party led her to resign from the emerging suffrage movement in 1867. Early Davis was another staunch conservative in everything except her recognition that education was central to any improvement in women's lot. It is no wonder the young Davies wrote that people who have not learned to do anything cannot find anything to do. When she had to go to nurse her brother, who had fallen in Algiers, she had the great good fortune to meet Barbara Leigh Smith. who encouraged her and reassured her that there were many other women who would sympathize with her longing and dissatisfaction. Back in England, Davies, along with her friend Elizabeth Garrett, visited Langham Place, which had become the quarters of both the English Woman Journal and a society for promoting the employment of women. She felt inspired She felt inspired, and when she returned to her home in North, formed a Northumberland and Durham branch of the society, as well as writing a series of letters to her local paper arguing the importance of increased employment opportunities for women. She was scathing about the meagre intellectual training available to girls like herself. Do they go to school? Uh, no. Do they have governess? No. They have lesson and get on as well as they can. And she described with great personal feeling, I quote, the weight of discouragement produced by being told that as women nothing much is ever uh, to be expected uh, of them, and whatever they do, they must not interest themselves except in a second hand and shallow way in the pursuit of man. For in such pursuit, they must always expect to fail. Women know how this kind of attitude stifle and chill, how hard it is to work courageously through it. But Davis was also encouraged by the growing recognition among the Langham Place group that education was all important. In London, the recently established Queen's College and Bedford College were offering something like an adequate schooling to some middle class girl, and in 1862, Davis managed to form a committee to further the prospect of women taking the university local examination, which had been established in 1858. It took a great deal of slow, careful organization and negotiation before Cambridge agreed, as an experiment in 1865, that women could attempt the same exam as men. Uh, though Davis was always a realist, she never retreated from her belief that girls must be offered exactly the same education as men at both school and university level. So this was the level of thinking of some of the feminists also. Uh, Her book on the higher education woman, which appeared in 1866, is careful not to state the claim too strongly. Davis admitted that women will probably never do as well as men, uh, but that does not seem to me a reason for not doing their best and choosing for themselves what they will try. She managed to raise money. Barbara Leigh Smith contributed generously to it to found a women's higher education college, which was set up at Hitchens in Hertfordshire with essentially just 5 students. So this was uh, the beginning of women education. In 1873, it moved to Cambridge and became Girton College. This was followed in 1879 by Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford. But for the all Emily Davis radical idea, she insisted from the start that women shouldn't take the same exams as men. She certainly did not want women to enjoy the same freedom as male students. She expected that her students would always behave decorously with the utmost propriety, unconventional and unfeminine behavior might, she believed, jeopardize the whole project. Emily Davis' pioneering were crucially important, though perhaps inevitably it was long time before women achieved anything approaching real equality in higher education. In London, Queen's and Bedford colleges began awarding degree to women in 1878. So this was their struggle to gain a degree. But Oxford women became full members of the university only in 1919. And paradoxically, though Cambridge granted women titular degree in 1921, they were not recognized as full member of the university until 1948. Elizabeth Garrett, which later became Garrett Adamson, also received support from the Langham Place group in her prolonged and courageous efforts in the face of what now seemed the most extraordinary opposition to train as a doctor. She was often the butt of crude joke. People laughed at her. Some male students announced their disapproval of the impropriety of males and females mingling. So in those days, In the European college also, they did not want did not believe in co-education and intermingling with female, while studying subjects which hitherto have been considered of a delicate nature. While the Lancet journal dismissed her effort to train as morbid, nothing shook Garrett in her determination. For one thing, she believed that women doctor would be a great boon to many suffering women. Moreover, the work interested her deeply, and she knew that she would be good at it. She was encouraged by the example of Elizabeth Blackwell, who had managed to graduate in medicine at a small college in New York State in 1849 and had opened a dispensary for women and children in the New York slums. But when Blackwell visited London, she was sometimes greeted with harsh criticism. It is impossible that women whose hand reek with gore can be possessed of the same nature of feelings as the generality of women, one columnist remarked. Elizabeth Garrett had to struggle hard to convince her own mother that her patient determination to work in medicine was not wrong or morbid, but the result of a healthy, active energy. Fortunately, her father was more supportive, and Garrett herself quietly, patiently persisted. She studied midwifery in Scotland, then won her MD diploma in Paris. Even the British Medical Journal, which had been consistently hostile to the idea of women in medicine, admitted that everyone must admire the indomitable perseverance and pluck which Miss Garrett has shown. By 1870, when she was persuaded to stand for election to the London School Board, she has obviously become a highly respected and popular public figure, and she received more votes than any other candidate. One of the most important and far-reaching campaign in the later part of the 19th century was also one of the most unexpected. The agitation against the Contagious Disease Act, which dramatically exposed the cruel hypocrisy of the double sexual standard. The first of the act had been passed in 1864 in certain ports and garrison town. Uh, Police were given the authority to arrest any woman who was merely suspected of being a prostitute, subject her sometime brutally to an external examination, and if there were any sign of venereal disease, to confine her to hospital. There were extension to the act in 1866 and 1869. So this was the condition of Europe. Everything was hostile against women. For women, women soon began protesting. They included Elizabeth Garrett, Florence Nightingale, and Harriet Martineau, who argued that the regulation system create horror whose worse than those which is supposed to restrain. By 1869, a Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Disease Act had been set up, a number of eminently respectable women forming the first real and effective pressure group. In the first instance, their campaign launched an attack on specific law that bore very brutally on prostitute or suspected prostitute, but they soon extended the argument to dramatize the working of the double sexual standard, with its disastrous effect on both men and women all through society. Josephine Butler soon became the group leader. The well educated daughter of a liberal family, she was beautiful, devout, and eminently respectable, hence, a superbly effective propagandist for what many people regarded as a highly respected unrespectable cause. She had already begun working with prostitutes when, after the tragic death of their only daughter, she and husband moved to Liverpool. I became possessed with an irresistible desire to go forth and find some pain keener than my own. She remarked. She took some unhappy fallen girls into her own home and raised money to establish a small house of rest that would care for dying Magdalenes. Butler had already displayed a keen interest in the problem facing women. A pamphlet on the education and employment of women, published in 1868, made the argument familiar by then for better education, also given the number of unmarried women in England, for adequate training to enable them to support themselves. In 1869, she and other sympathetic women formed a Ladies' National Association. Butler made a superbly effective figurehead and leader. Her speeches and writing Tigley combined cool, clear argument with passionate feeling. In a pamphlet written in 1871 and based on her own experience with prostitute, Butler argued that the Contagious Disease Act amounted to a suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act. They virtually introduce a species of villeinage or slavery. I use the word not sentimentally but in the strictest legal sense. The issue and her protest kindled the imagination and feeling of women all through the country. In an 1870 letter to the Prime Minister, a member of the Ladies' National Association has insisted that, I quote, there is not one of the mother's wife, sister, or daughter whom you cherish with proud affection who dare safely assert that, had she been born in the same unprotected, unfenced position, in the very jaws of poverty and vice, she too, in the innocent ignorance of her unfledged girlhood, might not have slipped like them into that awful gulf from which society at large has long done its best to make escape hopeless. Josephine Butler had and her rapidly growing band of highly respectable supporters soon became a remarkably effective pressure group. Their campaign exposed dramatically a brutal double sexual standard that long custom had made virtually invisible. And crucially, they argued it was double standard that oppressed not only prostitute but most women in all kinds of subtle way that spread through almost every aspect of their everyday domestic and working lives. Later, giving evidence to a parliamentary select committee, Butler pointed out that indirect but disastrous effect of the act on men as well as women. When she has visited Chatham, uh, I saw the evidence of the degradation of the young soldier who first joined the army. There were boys who appeared to be not more than 13. It was solemn as hell itself. The real villain, the real exploiter were, in her view, the prims, the people who made money by setting up a house in which women are sold to men. In the 1880s, Annie Besant tackled a different and perhaps even more urgent form of exploitation, describing the truly terrible condition in which women worked at the Bryant and May matchmaking factory in East London. She sent a deeply and effectively emotional letter to the many shareholders who happened to be clergymen. Let there rise before you the pale worn face of another man's daughter. As she pulls off her battered hat and shows her head robbed of its hair by the constant rubbing of her, the carried boxes robbed, therefore, that your dividends might be larger, Sir Cleric, I hold you up to the public opprobrium you deserve. Her charges were widely publicized and aroused great public concern. The match girls led sizable protest marches in London and were eventually allowed to form their own union. Progress on all issues facing women was now underway, but women as well as a few male champions like Thompson and Mill had been arguing for votes for women all through the century. In its closing decades, the demand would become urgent and suffragists and later militant suffragists would take center stage. So this was the condition of 19th century feminism in the 19th century in Europe. Yesterday I have discussed early 19th century and today the late 19th century. So and tomorrow I will be taking up the issue of fighting for the vote, how suffragists have fought for the vote, right to vote. And there is Ishu Mishra who is saying hi, hello. Then there is Fimo Lo Mayer saying hi, and Nazrul Haq saying ICC, and there is a message. So this was the struggle of women in Europe, how they have struggled through 18th century, 19th century, and how they have got the right to vote. This I will be discussing tomorrow. So I hope today's topic was clear. Thank you.